Good afternoon. Today we'll speak English, and we are the whole team of the retrospective. We are very happy to have with us Laura Mulvey, who's one of the most knowledgeable persons about cinema, and certainly about Douglas Sirk, and without any, there's no introduction. Laura Mulvey is a British essayist, writer, filmmaker also. She's written one of the definitive feminist theoretical manifestos on cinema, visual pleasure and narrative cinema. I'm sorry to bring up those old things, but still, that's where most of it started. And she's written and commented at length about Douglas Sirk and other filmmakers such as Max Ophüls, Joseph von Sternberg, and many others, of course. So I'll just give her the mic. Thank you, Laura, for being with us.
Well, I want to start. I have to start by thanking Bernard for inviting me, and it's an enormous pleasure for me to be here in Locarno. I've never been to the festival before, and it's a great excitement to be at this very special festival, but especially to be here and to be invited to the Douglas Sirk retrospective, and even more especially that it's now exactly 50 years, almost to the week, since August 1972, when the first Douglas Sirk retrospective was held at Edinburgh Film Festival. And just as John Halliday's Sirk on Sirk interview book had come out and Linda Miles organised the amazing retrospective, and even just, I can't say more amazing than the retrospective, but Mr. Sirk and his wife Hilda both arrived and joined us at the festival. So we had the opportunity to meet this extraordinarily charming, completely entrancing man. So I just wanted to put this memory at the beginning of the points that I'm going to make now. Now, my presentation is in two parts. The first part, I want to say a few things about the historical context for Written on the Wind, its place in Sirk's career, and in the second part, I'm going to talk quite personally about what Written on the Wind means to me, and pick out some of the some of its extraordinary cinematic attributes. So, first of all, to remember that this film was made in 1956, and the extent to which the 1950s was a crisis for Hollywood cinema. And I say this not just as historical background, but because it has a relevance to what we'll see on the screen, to the film Written on the Wind. As you probably all know, Hollywood was fighting television, and so it was bringing up as much as possible everything that was as unlike the little black and white box in the corner of the living room. And most of all, it was colour, cinematic values, the extraordinary qualities that the cinema could bring to itself. And here we see, in Written on the Wind, filmed in extraordinary technicolor, and also by with the genial, to use the French expression, genial cinematography of Russell Metty, who, if you notice in the sequences that take place in the Hadley house, where we have his extraordinary colour, deep focus on the famous universal staircase, 48 steps, I think, in the background. But throughout, you see a combination of tour de force cinematography and also a lushness of style, of decoration. Again, another collaborator of Sirk's, Alexander Golitsyn, was working on the decoration. So this was a film that was really celebrating the cinematic. Secondly, the movies were fighting back by bringing something adult to the screen. And not only were bringing something adult, which television was taboo for television, but also competing with the new European movies that were coming in and had more explicit sexual and personal content. And coming out in December of 1956, Written on the Wind was hyped by Universal with an intense pre-selling campaign as the frankest motion picture ever made. Now, the Hayes office tried to complain about the content, but without success. And it shows how times have changed at this point in the 50s, that they could be rushed away. Now, Sirk was achieving a picture status, and you see this very precisely with Written on the Wind, which has a big budget and an amazing cast. He had carefully nurtured Rock Hudson, who is now paying off by being one of the biggest box office, I think, in the United States at the time. And he was also, to a certain extent, carrying Lauren Bacall, who should have been the top star, but whose status was slightly on the wane. And these two carried the two great supporting actors, both nominated for Academy Awards, Dorothy Malone and Robert Stack. Malone won an Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress. But also behind Written on the Wind was Albert Sugsmith, a kind of maverick producer who was working under the Universal umbrella at the time, and allowed a kind of more eccentricity, more flexibility, and certainly to play with a more scandalous edge than he had been with the previous front office regime at Universal. Now, I'm moving on to part two of my presentation, which is really very much about my own feelings for Sirk and for this film. When I first, this is a preamble, when I first got to love the films of Douglas Sirk with a special devotion in the 1970s, it was for his films made about women, for women audiences, the way that he allowed aging stars, whether it was Jane Wyman or Lana Turner, a place for well tour de force performances. But also, in terms of Written on the Wind, you see another interest that Sirk had been nurturing for a long time in gender, which was much more about masculinity, and particularly masculinity in crisis. And Robert Stack's Kyle Hadley is one of the great examples of his work on the male and the neurotic, darker aspects of what was so normally concealed by an official patriarchy. So in a sense, you see the unconscious of the patriarchy kind of bubbling up in Robert Stack's performance. But this interest, and I just want to mention this very quickly, had gone back to Sirk's earlier films. He mentions Willy Bergol, particularly he says, Bergol in zu neuen Ufern, the type of character I've always been interested in, the doubtful, the uncertain, the ambiguous. Uncertainty and the vagueness of men's aims are central to many of my films, however hidden these characteristics might be. And this type of character returns with the three films that he made with George Sanders, each of which is a kind of masterpiece of irony and ambiguity. Then, discussing his later Sugsmith films with John Halliday, he develops his concept of this split character, the ambivalent character. He says, how the split characters need to be in opposition to immovable characters. In Written on the Wind, I think I hit a fair balance, because you had interesting characters, Stack and Malone, both brilliantly acted, and you had the counterbalance with Hudson and McCall, both being rather normal, not split within themselves. And Robert Stack recalls in his memoirs, the part of Kyle Hadley called on me to express emotions that I didn't even know I had before. It was the kind of part that an actor dreams of getting before the fear sets in. Now, I want to say make a couple of last points about the film itself. Note its circularity, a Sirkian circularity, that the opening sequence is a flashback, which will return later in its place in the narrative. But I wanted to point out that the scale of Written on the Wind, its kind of magnificent scale, allows to build into the film some quite extraordinary cinematic moments. And I just want to mention 3 of them. The first part of the film is a kind of build-up to the relationship between Kyle Hadley and Lucy. And the central point comes in a hotel in Miami, which is beautifully constructed around 5 shots with a symmetrical balance. Kyle is trying to seduce Lucy with his wealth, and there are 2 shots balancing each other in her hotel bedroom, one laying out his seduction, a pivot point, and then his disappointment. Those 2 shots balance each other in a very beautiful way with an altered mise-en-scène, and on either side are 2 extraordinary shots in the hotel's pink reception area. So just look out for that particular scene. Also notice the way in which the film is colour-coded in dress, so that Robert Stack and Lauren McCall are both wearing practically matching grey, and Rock Hudson as Mitch is nearer to nature in brown. And notice the fantastic mirror shot in the middle of the first hotel bedroom scene, and also its various kind of what Orson Welles once called dollar book Freud references, which we could come back to also towards the end. The second part of the film in Hadley Town builds up to the kind of neurotic, desperate crisis through various extraordinarily worked out scenes, again using mirrors and highly developed mise-en-scène, but ends with a moment of crisis worked out through a montage sequence. A kind of montage sequence which I think, I don't know if Bernard agrees with me or not, which was quite rare for Hollywood during this period. Literally the kind of montage that expresses violence, despair, an excess of emotion that then leads to death. So in the first part, the climactic point is in the middle. The second part, it comes at the end of that extraordinary section. But the last part, to my mind, is slightly the fallout from what we've seen up till there, and leading naturally, of course, to the courtroom drama, but to my mind, also leading to what was originally the last shot of the film. Universal added a kind of coda. Now, the last shot of the film is Mary Lee, supposedly a nymphomaniac, actually chasing Rock Hudson's Mitch, and chasing men who remind her of him throughout the film. But she ends up sitting at her father's desk, dressed like her father, inheriting the business of the oil business, and like him, holding in her hand a miniature oil derrick. Now, Bernard, I noticed, said, I think that c'était quelque chose trop phallique. It's a symbol trop phallique.
I wasn't the first one to notice that.
Tufo was the first.
I would just like, as a final point, to slightly revise and perhaps slightly disagree with Bernard and say that when we see this phallic symbol in Mary's hands, it's not so much a phallic symbol, but it's actually also a memory that all the time she's returning to her childhood dream of playing with the boys, of being, as it were, before she was a girl, before she had an oppressive femininity imposed on her, when she was a tomboy. And in a sense, her so-called nymphomania is also a refusal to give way to the passivity of femininity that's so appropriately and properly personified by Lucy and Laura, of course. So I feel we could see enough Turigliatto, perhaps, in that last shot, and use it to think back to Marily's character. Now, my final point is that something, I hope I'm not going on too long, this is genuinely my last point. Say something a little bit more general about Douglas Sirk and the atmosphere of Hollywood in the 1950s. I said something about the crisis of the industry at the beginning, but I wanted to end by reflecting on the way that that crisis of the industry perhaps also had an impact on these great directors who'd been making movies, been born almost of just a few years, 1900, a few years after the birth of cinema itself, had grown up with the cinema, and were now witnessing the end of their own careers and the end of the industry that had so beautifully nurtured them, and which they had consistently fought against. Now, I wanted, it occurred to me thinking about this, that these directors, seeing their industry on its deathbed, produced something that we might call a late style, and it might seem absurd to take Edward Said's concept of late style and apply it to the kind of vulgar, popular form of the cinema, as he evolved it for the late Beethoven and for Adorno. But it seems to me that some of the great directors of the 50s did develop a late style, and I just wanted to quote from, just to end with Said's point, and I want to end particularly with this reference through Beethoven, through Adorno, as being so appropriate for Douglas Sirk, the great German European intellectual, and I hope you might have liked this. Said said certain artists and thinkers care enough about their métier to believe that it too ages and must face death with failing senses and memory. As Adorno said about Beethoven, late style does not admit the definitive cadences of death. Instead, death appears as a refracted mode, as irony. The irony is how often lateness as theme and style keeps reminding us of death. And I'd just like to present to you, Written on the Wind, as I think a very beautiful example of Hollywood at its peak of late style.